The dust cloud rose behind the wagon train like a golden curtain separating Catherine Ashford from everything she had ever known. And as she pressed her hand against her burning forehead, she realized with dawning horror that the white canvas tops were growing smaller in the distance, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the Colorado plains. She had wandered just beyond the rocky outcropping that morning in 1872, desperately seeking privacy for her illness, and when she finally emerged on trembling legs, the caravan had vanished over the western ridge. Catherine called out, her voice cracking and weak, but the wind carried her words away into nothing. Her carpetbag lay beside her, the only possession she had taken when nature's urgent call had driven her from the wagon, and now she stood alone in a landscape so immense it seemed to swallow her whole. The sun beat down mercilessly on her dark hair, and she could feel the fever still coursing through her body, making her thoughts swim and her vision blur at the edges. She had been sick for 3 days, quietly suffering in the back of the Hendersons' wagon, not wanting to be a burden, not wanting them to regret their kindness in allowing her passage west after her aunt had died in St. Louis. Now she understood why Mrs. Henderson had seemed so cold that morning, why she had barely looked at Catherine when she stumbled away from camp. They had left her deliberately. A sick woman was a liability, and the wagon master had no patience for delays. Catherine sank to her knees on the hard ground, feeling the sharp stones press through her already tattered skirt. She had $43 sewn into the lining of her bodice, a change of clothes in her bag, and no idea which direction Fort Garland lay. The guidebook she had studied so carefully in St. Louis was packed in a trunk on the Henderson wagon, along with most of her belongings. She tried to remember the maps, the landmarks, but her fevered mind could only conjure images of her aunt's face in those final days, pale and drawn in the boarding house bed. She forced herself to stand, swaying slightly. If she stayed here, she would die. That much was certain. The Colorado Territory in August was unforgiving, and she had perhaps a day's worth of water in the canteen she had thankfully taken with her that morning. She began walking, choosing west because that had been the direction of the wagon train, because Fort Garland lay somewhere in that direction, nestled in the San Luis Valley beneath the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Hours passed in a haze of heat and pain. Catherine's boots, which had seemed sturdy in St. Louis, rubbed blisters on her heels with every step. She rationed her water carefully, taking small sips even though her throat burned with thirst. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, rolling plains covered in sagebrush and dried grass, with the purple mountains rising in the distance like a promise she could never reach. She thought about her parents, dead these 5 years from cholera. She thought about her aunt, who had taken her in and then succumbed to consumption. She thought about the teaching position that supposedly awaited her in San Francisco, a position that now seemed like a fairy tale told to a foolish girl. When the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Catherine finally admitted to herself that she could go no farther. Her legs were shaking, her fever had worsened, and the world tilted dangerously whenever she tried to focus on anything. She found a small depression in the ground, partially sheltered by a cluster of rocks, and collapsed into it. She used her carpetbag as a pillow and pulled her shawl over her shoulders, even though the air was still warm. She knew that desert nights grew cold, another fact from the guidebook that now seemed to mock her. She must have slept, because when she opened her eyes again, the stars were thick overhead, more stars than she had ever seen in St. Louis, so many they seemed to form a glowing river across the black sky. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering, and she pulled the shawl tighter. She thought she heard coyotes howling in the distance, and fear joined the fever in making her heart race. She closed her eyes and prayed, words she had not spoken since her parents died, desperate pleas to a God who seemed very far away. The sun woke her, blazing down from directly overhead, and Catherine realized with distant alarm that she had slept through the morning. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she reached for her canteen, she found it empty. She did not remember drinking the last of the water, but she must have. She tried to stand and fell back, her legs refusing to support her weight. This is how it ends, she thought with strange clarity. 22 years old and dying alone in Colorado. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, a steady rhythm that she first mistook for her own heartbeat. Then a shadow fell across her, blocking the brutal sun, and she squinted up at the figure on horseback. He was backlit by the sun, his face in shadow, but she could make out the shape of his hat, the broad line of his shoulders, the rifle resting across his saddle. "Jesus Christ," she heard him say, and his voice was rough but not unkind. "Madam, can you hear me?" Catherine tried to answer, but her throat was too dry. She managed a small nod. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with the easy grace of someone who had spent his entire life on horseback. He knelt beside her, and now she could see his face properly. He was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-bronzed skin and dark eyes that assessed her with professional concern. His jaw was shadowed with several days' worth of beard, and there was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, but his mouth was gentle as he uncapped his canteen and held it to her lips. "Slow now," he said, "just a little at a time." The water was the most wonderful thing Catherine had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down to drain the canteen, but he pulled it back after a few sips, making her wait before he allowed her more. "What happened?" he asked. "Where's your party?" "Gone," Catherine managed to whisper. "Wagon train, I was sick. They left." Something dark flashed across his face, anger that was not directed at her. "How long ago?" "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe longer." He glanced at the sun, then back at her, and she saw him calculating distances and time. "You have been walking since yesterday morning?" "Yes, I tried, but I cannot." The words came out broken, and to her horror she felt tears sliding down her dusty cheeks. "I cannot go any farther." "Hey now," he said, and his voice was surprisingly tender. "You do not need to. I will get you out of here." He stood and went back to his horse, returning with a bedroll that he unfolded beside her. Then, with gentle efficiency, he lifted her onto it. Despite her fever-weakened state, Catherine felt a flutter of alarm at being handled by a strange man, but she was too exhausted to protest. "My name is Thomas Addison," he said as he worked. "I have a ranch about 8 miles east of here. I am going to take you there, get you fed and rested. Then we will figure out what to do next." "Catherine," she whispered. "Catherine Ashford." "Catherine," he repeated, and somehow the way he said her name made it sound new, like she was being introduced to herself for the first time. "I am going to lift you onto my horse now. It might hurt a bit, but I will be as careful as I can." He was strong, that much was immediately apparent. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, settling her onto his saddle before mounting behind her. One arm came around her waist, holding her secure against his chest, and she felt the solid warmth of him seeping through her clothes. It should have felt improper, being held this way by a man she had just met, but Catherine was too grateful for the support to care about propriety. "Hold on," Thomas said, and clicked his tongue to his horse. They rode east, back the way Catherine had come, though she recognized nothing of the landscape. She drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Thomas's steady presence behind her, the rhythmic movement of the horse, the sun slowly arcing across the sky. Once, she felt him adjust his hold on her, drawing her closer when she started to slip. Another time, she heard him speaking low words that might have been meant for her or for the horse. She could not tell. When she next woke with any clarity, the sun was lower in the sky, and she could see buildings in the distance. Not a town, but a ranch, just as he had promised. There was a main house built of logs, sturdy and substantial, with a stone chimney rising from one end. Beyond it were corrals, a barn, and several outbuildings. She could see horses moving in the pastures, and the whole place had an air of prosperity that surprised her. This was not some rough homesteader's claim, but an established operation. Thomas guided his horse right up to the front porch of the house, where a woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun, and her eyes widened when she saw Catherine. "Lord have mercy, Thomas, what did you find?" "Wagon train left her behind, Martha. She is sick and half dead from exposure. Can you help her?" "Of course I can." "Bring her inside. Quickly now." Martha held the door as Thomas carried Catherine into the house, and she had a vague impression of cool dimness, rough-hewn furniture, and clean swept floors before she was being laid on a bed in a small room. Martha's competent hands began undoing the buttons on her bodice, and Catherine tried to protest, but the older woman shushed her. "None of that now. You need to get out of these dusty clothes and into something clean. Thomas, you go on and let me tend to her. Send Ben to fetch Dr. Morrison if he is not out on calls." "Yes, madam," Thomas said, and Catherine heard his footsteps retreat, heard the door close softly behind him. Martha worked efficiently, stripping Catherine of her travel-stained dress and undergarments, washing her with cool water from a basin, and dressing her in a soft cotton nightgown that smelled of lavender. Catherine wanted to thank her, wanted to explain, but every time she tried to speak, Martha told her to hush and rest. Finally, clean and comfortable for the first time in days, Catherine let herself sink into the softness of the feather mattress and fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke again, it was dark outside, and a lamp burned low on a table beside the bed. A man she did not recognize sat in a chair nearby, gray-haired and distinguished-looking, with a black bag resting beside his feet. He noticed her eyes opening and leaned forward with a slight smile. "Miss Ashford, I am Dr. Morrison. How are you feeling?" Catherine took inventory of her body. Her head still ached, but the fierce heat of the fever seemed to have abated. Her throat was raw and her muscles felt like water, but she was alive. "Better, I think." "Good. You had quite a fever when I examined you earlier. Heat exhaustion combined with what appears to be influenza. Another day in the sun and you would not have made it." He stood and picked up his bag. "Martha will bring you some broth shortly. Drink as much as you can and rest. I will check on you tomorrow." "Dr. Morrison," Catherine said, and he paused at the door. "Thank you, and please thank Mr. Addison. He saved my life." "That he did," the doctor agreed. "Thomas is a good man. You are in excellent hands here." He left, and a few minutes later, Martha appeared with a tray bearing a bowl of rich beef broth and some soft bread. "Can you sit up, dear?" Martha asked, and helped Catherine arrange the pillows behind her back. "Doctor says you are to eat slowly, just a little at a time." The broth was delicious, salty and nourishing, and Catherine felt strength flowing back into her body with each spoonful. As she ate, Martha settled into the chair the doctor had vacated and studied her with frank curiosity. "Thomas says the wagon train left you behind. That is a cruel thing." "I was sick," Catherine explained quietly. "I suppose they thought I was too much of a burden." "Still cruel," Martha said firmly. "A decent wagon master would not abandon a young woman in the middle of nowhere." She shook her head. Well, you are safe now. This is Thomas's ranch, the Twin Pine. I am his housekeeper, have been since he was a boy. You will stay here until you are well enough to travel, and then we will figure out where you need to go. I was heading to Fort Garland, Catherine said. I have money saved. I can pay for my room and board. We will talk about that when you are feeling better, Martha said, in a tone that suggested the matter was closed for now. Finish your broth and get some more sleep. Tomorrow you will feel more like yourself. Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to insist on being useful, on not being a burden again, but exhaustion was already pulling her back down. Martha took the tray, tucked the quilts around her, and turned down the lamp. Catherine fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside the window and the distant lowing of cattle. The next several days passed in a blur of sleeping and waking, of Martha's gentle care and the doctor's regular visits. Catherine's fever broke completely on the third day, and by the fourth, she was able to sit up in bed for longer periods, though she still felt weak as a kitten. Martha brought her meals, helped her wash, and kept her company with stories about the ranch and the territory. Thomas came to check on her morning and evening, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, asking politely how she was feeling. Catherine found herself watching for those visits, her heart lifting slightly when she heard his footsteps in the hall. He never stayed long, always mindful of propriety, but his concern seemed genuine. She learned that he was 28 years old, that he had inherited the ranch from his father 6 years prior, and that he ran a cattle operation with help from half a dozen hands who lived in the bunkhouse. "Mr. Addison," Catherine said one evening when he came to check on her, "I want to thank you properly. You saved my life. I do not know how to repay such a debt." Thomas looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "No debt, Miss Ashford. Any decent person would have done the same. Perhaps, but you are the one who actually did it. You could have ridden past. Many men would have." "I am not many men," he said simply, and something in the way he said it made her believe him. "Besides, you were in trouble. A man does not leave a woman to die in the desert if he can help it." "Still, thank you," he nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "You are welcome. Now you just focus on getting better. Martha says you are improving every day." On the 7th day, Catherine felt strong enough to get out of bed and dress properly. Martha had laundered her clothes, mending the tears and brushing out the dust, and Catherine put on her best dress, a modest gray cotton with a white collar. She braided her hair, pinched some color into her pale cheeks, and walked slowly out into the main room of the house. Thomas was sitting at the large wooden table, going over account books, and he looked up in surprise when she appeared. He stood immediately, the chair scraping back. "Miss Ashford, should you be out of bed?" "I have spent a week in that bed, Mr. Addison. If I stay there any longer, I will go mad." Catherine smiled tentatively. "Besides, I feel much better. The doctor said yesterday that I am recovering well. That is good news." Thomas gestured to the chair across from him. "Would you like to sit? Martha just made coffee." Catherine settled into the chair, grateful for its support. Her legs were still unsteady, but it felt wonderful to be upright and dressed like a proper person again. Thomas poured her coffee and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup, breathing in the rich aroma. "I need to speak with you about my situation," Catherine said, deciding that directness was best. "I have money, as I mentioned to Martha. I can pay you for my care, and I need to make arrangements to continue to Fort Garland." Thomas set down his own coffee cup and regarded her seriously. "Fort Garland is about 40 miles west of here. It is a decent town. Military fort there keeps things relatively peaceful." "What were you planning to do once you arrived?" "I am a teacher," Catherine said. "Or rather, I was training to be one. My aunt ran a small school in St. Louis before she died. I have my certification, and I was told there is a need for teachers in the Western Territories. I plan to inquire about positions in Fort Garland or the surrounding areas. There is a school in Fort Garland, Thomas confirmed. I know the teacher there, Miss Elizabeth Hartley. She is getting on in years, must be close to 60 now. I suspect she would welcome an assistant, or perhaps she is thinking of retiring soon. Hope flared in Catherine's chest. Do you really think there might be a position available? I think it is worth inquiring about. Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. But Miss Ashford, you have only just recovered from a serious illness. You are in no condition to travel 40 miles, whether by horse or wagon. Why do you not stay here a few more weeks, regain your strength properly, and then I will take you into Fort Garland myself. You can meet Miss Hartley, see about the teaching position. I cannot impose on your hospitality for weeks, Mr. Addison. You and Martha have already done so much. It is not an imposition, Thomas said firmly. Martha enjoys having another woman in the house, and Lord knows this place is big enough. My father built it expecting a large family. He did not get one, but the space is here. Something shadowed crossed his face, some old pain, but it was gone before Catherine could analyze it. Besides, you could be useful if you wanted to be. I have letters that need writing, accounts that need organizing. My father taught me to read and cipher, but my hand is clumsy with a pen. If you wanted to earn your keep, you could help me with that. Catherine considered the offer. It made sense, though part of her chafed at being dependent on anyone, even someone as kind as Thomas Addison. But he was right that she was not strong enough to travel, and the thought of staying here a bit longer, of having a purpose beyond simply recovering, was appealing. I would be happy to help with your correspondence, she said finally. And Mr. Addison, thank you. You have been very generous. Thomas, he said, if you are going to be staying here a while, you might as well call me Thomas, and I will call you Catherine if that is acceptable. It is acceptable, Catherine agreed, and found that she liked the sound of her name in his voice. The days took on a new rhythm after that. Catherine spent her mornings helping Martha with lighter household tasks, learning to bake bread the way they did in Colorado, to churn butter, to preserve the summer vegetables that came from Martha's kitchen garden. In the afternoons, she worked with Thomas in his study, a small room off the main living area that was lined with shelves holding agricultural journals and a few precious books. Thomas had not been exaggerating about his penmanship. His handwriting was a sprawling scrawl, barely legible, but his mind was sharp and his business sense was excellent. Catherine wrote letters to cattle buyers in Denver, to the Army quartermaster at Fort Garland about supplying beef, to ranchers in New Mexico about purchasing breeding stock. She organized his accounts, creating neat columns of figures that showed the ranch was quite profitable. Between the cattle operation and the horses Thomas bred, the Twin Pine Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the San Luis Valley. Your father built something impressive here, Catherine observed one afternoon as she finished copying a contract. This ranch is substantial. He was a hard worker, Thomas said, a note of pride in his voice. Came out here in '55 when this was still wild country. Built the house, started the herd with just a dozen cattle. By the time he died, he had 500 head and a reputation for raising the best horses in the territory. And you have carried on his legacy. I have tried. Thomas looked out the window at the pastures stretching beyond the house. Sometimes I wonder if he would be proud of what I have done with the place. I think any father would be proud of a son like you, Catherine said softly, and meant it. Thomas turned to look at her, something warm and complicated in his dark eyes, but before he could respond, they heard Martha calling from the kitchen that supper was ready. The evenings were Catherine's favorite time. After the dishes were washed and put away, the three of them would sit on the wide front porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains and paint the sky in impossible colors. Thomas would sometimes play his harmonica, simple tunes that drifted across the quiet ranch. Martha would knit, her needles clicking rhythmically. And Catherine would simply sit and feel peaceful for the first time since her aunt had died. One evening, about 3 weeks after Thomas had found her, Martha announced that she needed to visit her sister in Fort Garland for a few days. Her sister was poorly, and Martha wanted to check on her and help with her household. "I will take you in the wagon tomorrow," Thomas said immediately, "and I can bring you back whenever you are ready." "That would be a kindness, Thomas." Martha glanced at Catherine. "You will be all right here, dear. I have meals prepared, and there is not much that needs doing." "I will be fine," Catherine assured her, though she felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of being alone at the ranch with Thomas, even with the ranch hands in the bunkhouse nearby. It was not that she did not trust him. In the weeks she had been here, he had been nothing but respectful, never overstepping or making her feel uncomfortable. But there was something growing between them, she could feel it, a connection that went beyond gratitude or simple friendship. She saw the way his gaze lingered on her sometimes, the way his smile came easier when she was near. And she knew that her own heart had begun to betray her, that she looked forward to their afternoons together with an anticipation that had nothing to do with correspondence or accounts. The next morning, Thomas hitched up the wagon and helped Martha onto the seat. Catherine stood on the porch waving as they pulled away, and then the ranch was suddenly very quiet. She went inside and busied herself with cleaning, with organizing, with anything to keep her hands occupied. Around midday, one of the ranch hands knocked on the door with a request from Thomas. Could she please look through the breeding records and make a list of which horses had been bred to which mares this season? Thomas wanted to reference it when he returned. Catherine threw herself into the task, glad for the distraction. The breeding records were kept in large ledgers, and she spent the afternoon creating a neat chart showing bloodlines and expected foaling dates. She was so absorbed in the work that she did not hear Thomas return until the front door opened and he walked into the study. "You made good time," Catherine said, looking up with a smile. "The wagon is faster than a single horse," Thomas replied. He looked tired, dusty from the road, but his eyes were warm as they met hers. "How was your day?" "Productive. I have the breeding records organized for you." Thomas came to stand beside her desk, leaning over to look at the chart she had created. He was close enough that she could smell the scent of him, leather and horses and the outdoors, and she found her breath catching slightly. "This is excellent work, Catherine. Thank you. It was no trouble." They stood there for a moment, the air between them feeling charged somehow, heavy with things unsaid. Then Thomas cleared his throat and stepped back. "I should clean up before supper. There is leftover chicken in the icebox that Martha prepared." "I will heat it up," Catherine said, grateful for the excuse to move, to do something with her suddenly restless hands. They ate together at the big table, the silence between them comfortable but also weighted with awareness. Catherine found herself watching Thomas, noticing things she had tried not to notice before. The way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the strength in his hands as he cut his food, the scar through his eyebrow that gave him a slightly roguish appearance despite his steady demeanor. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, gesturing to his eyebrow. Thomas touched it unconsciously. "Horse threw me when I was 17. I was too cocky, thought I could break a wild Mustang without help, landed on a rock and split my head open. Martha had to stitch me up while my father stood there telling me how foolish I had been. Were you very hurt?" "My pride more than anything else. But I learned to be more careful, to respect the animals I work with. They are not tools. They are living creatures with their own minds and spirits. You are good with them, Catherine observed. I have watched you with the horses. They trust you. Trust has to be earned with animals and with people. Thomas met her eyes across the table. You cannot force it or demand it. You have to be patient and consistent and kind. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding that he was talking about more than just horses. "And have I earned your trust?" she asked quietly. "You have," Thomas said. "More than I expected when I found you out there in the desert." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Catherine, I need to tell you something, and I do not want you to feel obligated in any way, but you should know." Her heart was pounding now, anticipation and nervousness warring in her chest. "What is it?" "I have come to care for you a great deal these past weeks. More than I should, probably, given that you are my guest and under my protection. But I find myself thinking about you all the time, looking forward to our afternoons together, to seeing you smile." He took a breath. "I know you were planning to go to Fort Garland to find a teaching position. And if that is still what you want, I will take you there and help you in any way I can. But I want you to know that I would be very happy if you chose to stay here instead. As my wife, if you would have me." Catherine sat frozen, her mind reeling. She had sensed his feelings, had felt the pull between them, but she had not expected a proposal. Not so soon, not so directly. "Thomas, I do not know what to say." "Say you will think about it," he said quickly. "I know this is sudden. I know you have only known me a few weeks. But Catherine, I am 30 years old, and I have never felt about any woman the way I feel about you. You are intelligent and capable and kind. You work hard and do not complain. You fit here at this ranch in this life. And I think, I hope, that maybe you have come to care for me too." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, at this good man who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, who had given her shelter and safety and treated her with unfailing respect. She thought about the life he was offering, a life very different from the one she had imagined for herself. She had planned to be independent, to support herself through teaching, to rely on no one. But was that what she truly wanted? Or was it simply what she had thought was her only option? "I do care for you," she admitted softly. "I did not want to at first. I did not want to be dependent on anyone, to owe anyone. But you have made that impossible. You are a good man, Thomas Addison, and yes, I have come to care for you very much." Hope blazed in his eyes. "Then you will consider my proposal." "I will consider it," Catherine promised. "But Thomas, I need you to understand something. I am not some damsel who needs rescuing. I am a grown woman who can make her own choices. If I marry you, it will not be out of gratitude or obligation. It will be because I want to build a life with you as your partner and equal." "I would not want it any other way," Thomas said fervently. "Catherine, I do not need someone to keep house and cook meals. Martha already does that. I need a partner, someone who can help me make decisions about the ranch, someone I can talk to at the end of the day. I need you." The simple honesty of his words broke through the last of Catherine's hesitation. She stood from her chair and walked around the table to where he sat. Thomas rose to meet her, and they stood facing each other, close enough to touch. "Ask me again," Catherine whispered. "Catherine Ashford, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and felt joy bloom in her chest like a flower opening to the sun. "Yes, I will marry you." Thomas let out a sound that was half laugh, half shout of triumph, and then his arms were around her, pulling her close. Catherine wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid strength of him, the warm reality of this moment. He held her like she was precious, like she was something to be treasured, and she realized that this was what love felt like. Not the desperate need she had seen in some couples, not the cold arrangement that passed for marriage in many households, But this, a partnership and attraction and genuine affection all wrapped together. Thomas pulled back enough to look at her face, his hands coming up to frame her cheeks. "I want to do this properly," he said. "Court you, let you get to know me better, have a real wedding with a preacher and witnesses." "How long do you think a proper courtship should last?" Catherine asked, her lips curving into a smile. "At least a few weeks," Thomas said, but his voice was teasing now, warm with happiness. "Maybe a month. We do not want people to talk." "People will talk anyway," Catherine pointed out. "A single woman living at her ranch with a bachelor, even with Martha here, will set tongues wagging." "Then let them wag. I do not care what people think as long as you are happy." "I am happy," Catherine said, and realized it was true. After months of grief and uncertainty, after nearly dying in the desert, she had found something she had not even known she was looking for. She had found home. Martha returned 3 days later and immediately noticed the change between them. She took one look at Catherine and Thomas sitting together on the porch, his hand covering hers, and broke into a delighted smile. "Well, it is about time," she declared. "I have been watching you two dance around each other for weeks." "We were not dancing around each other," Thomas protested, but he was grinning. "You certainly were. Any fool could see you were smitten with the girl from the moment you carried her in here." Martha came up the porch steps and pulled Catherine into a warm hug. "I am very happy for you both. Your father would have loved her, Thomas." "I think he would have," Thomas agreed quietly. They set the wedding date for late September, giving themselves a month to prepare and to let people in the valley get to know Catherine. Thomas took her into Fort Garland the following week, driving the wagon carefully over the rough roads. Catherine watched the landscape pass, so different from the desperate walk she had made trying to reach this same destination. Now she was traveling with Thomas beside her, his presence steady and reassuring, and she felt no fear at all. Fort Garland was larger than she had expected. A proper town with a main street lined with businesses, the military fort at one end, and houses spreading out beyond. Thomas drove directly to the school, a neat white building with a bell tower, and helped Catherine down from the wagon. Miss Elizabeth Hartley turned out to be a brisk, intelligent woman with sharp blue eyes and a warm smile. She listened to Catherine explain about her training, her certification, and her plans, and then she nodded decisively. "I could use an assistant teacher," Miss Hartley said. "My enrollment has grown to 43 students, far too many for one teacher to handle effectively. If you are willing to take on the younger students, say ages 5 through 10, I will teach the older children. The pay is not much, $30 a month, but it is steady." "I would be honored," Catherine said, her heart soaring at the prospect of actually using her training, of doing the work she had prepared for. "When can you start?" Catherine glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "The beginning of October. I am getting married at the end of September." Miss Hartley's eyebrows rose as she looked between Catherine and Thomas, and then her expression softened into understanding. "Congratulations to you both. October will be perfect. That gives me time to reorganize the classroom and notify the parents." They left the school and walked down the main street, Thomas pointing out various businesses and introducing Catherine to the people they met. The baker, the blacksmith, the owner of the general store, all greeted Thomas with obvious respect and welcomed Catherine warmly. She could feel their curiosity, knew they were wondering about this woman who had appeared from nowhere to claim the valley's most eligible bachelor. But no one was unkind. At the general store, Thomas insisted on buying Catherine fabric for a wedding dress. She protested that it was too much, but he was adamant, and she found herself falling in love with a bolt of cream-colored silk that the storekeeper said had just arrived from Denver. "Martha can help you sew it," Thomas said, as the storekeeper measured out the yardage. "She is an excellent seamstress. I can sew my own dress," Catherine said, a bit indignantly. "I know you can, but why not let Martha help? She has been dying to fuss over a bride for years. It would make her happy." Catherine relented, recognizing the truth in his words. Martha had been so kind to her, and she could tell the older woman was thrilled about the wedding. Letting her help with the dress would be a gift, not an imposition. They had lunch at the town's restaurant, a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and then headed back to the ranch. On the way, Thomas taught her to handle the wagon reins, showing her how to guide the horses, how to read their ears and tails to understand their mood. Catherine found she enjoyed it, the sense of control and capability that came with managing the team. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Martha and Catherine worked on the wedding dress in the evenings, their needles flying as they created something beautiful from the cream silk. Thomas threw himself into ranch work, but Catherine noticed he was also making improvements to the house. New curtains appeared in the bedroom that would be theirs, bright calico that let in the morning light. He fixed the squeaky board in the hallway, replaced a broken window pane, and built a small bookshelf in the study for Catherine's books. One evening, about 2 weeks before the wedding, Thomas took Catherine on a horseback ride up into the foothills. She had been practicing her riding, working with a gentle mare named Clover, and she felt confident enough to manage the trail. They rode for an hour, climbing steadily, until they reached a clearing that looked out over the entire valley. The view was breathtaking. Below them, the ranch spread out like a toy farm, the buildings tiny and perfect. Beyond it, the valley stretched away in a patchwork of ranches and farms, all of it framed by the dramatic peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and amber light. "My father used to bring me up here," Thomas said as they dismounted. "When I was a boy and things were difficult. He said that looking at the land from up here reminded him why he worked so hard, what he was building." "It is beautiful," Catherine said softly. "I wanted to show you this before we married. I wanted you to see what our life will look like, the land we will work and build on. This valley is not easy, Catherine. The winters are hard, the summers are harsh, and ranching is brutal work. But it is a good life, an honest one." Catherine turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "I know it will not be easy. But Thomas, I am not afraid of hard work. I am not afraid of difficulty. What frightens me is the thought of a life without purpose, without meaning. Here with you I have both." Thomas pulled her close, and they stood there in the fading light, wrapped in each other's arms, looking out at the land that would be their future. The wedding took place on a perfect September day, clear and cool with just a hint of autumn in the air. They held the ceremony at the ranch, with Dr. Morrison serving as one witness and the ranch foreman, a grizzled cowboy named Ben Tucker, serving as the other. The preacher from Fort Garland rode out to perform the service, and Martha cried happy tears as Catherine and Thomas exchanged their vows. Catherine wore the cream silk dress, her hair pinned up with wildflowers that Martha had gathered that morning. Thomas wore a new black suit that made him look unfamiliar and handsome, though he tugged uncomfortably at the collar. When the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, Thomas cupped Catherine's face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that she felt tears prick her own eyes. "I love you," he whispered against her lips, and she whispered it back, meaning it with all her heart. They had a simple celebration afterward, with food Martha had been preparing for days and music provided by Ben Tucker's fiddle. Several neighboring ranchers and their families came to offer congratulations, and Catherine found herself welcomed into a community she had not even known existed a few months before. These were good people, hardworking and generous, and they seemed genuinely pleased that Thomas had found a wife. As the sun set and the guests began to depart, Thomas led Catherine into the house, into the bedroom that was now truly theirs. He had lit candles, and their soft glow made everything look magical. Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness, despite the love she felt for him, despite wanting this. Thomas seemed to sense her hesitation, and he took her hands gently. "We have all the time in the world," he said softly. "There is no rush, Catherine. I want this to be right for you." His patience, his understanding, made her love him even more. She stepped closer, reaching up to unknot his tie. "I am not afraid," she said. "I trust you, Thomas." Their wedding night was everything Catherine had hoped it would be, tender and passionate, a joining that was both physical and emotional. Thomas was gentle with her, careful of her inexperience, and she marveled at the intimacy of it, the way their bodies fit together, the way he whispered endearments against her skin. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, and Catherine felt complete in a way she never had before. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked, his hand stroking her hair where it spilled across the pillow. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Catherine replied honestly. Life settled into a rhythm after that, a pattern of work and love that felt both comfortable and exciting. Catherine threw herself into preparing for her teaching position, creating lesson plans and gathering materials. Thomas continued to run the ranch, but now he included Catherine in his decisions, asking her opinion on purchases and breeding choices. She discovered she had a good head for business, and together they made plans to expand the horse breeding operation. October arrived, and Catherine began teaching at the Fort Garland school. She rode into town 3 days a week, staying overnight with Miss Hartley on those days to avoid the long ride back to the ranch each evening. It was not an ideal arrangement, being away from Thomas, but they made it work. On the days she was at the ranch, she helped Martha with household tasks and worked on ranch correspondence. On teaching days, she poured her energy into her students, finding joy in their curiosity and growth. The children adored her, responding to her patient teaching methods and genuine interest in their progress. Parents began to comment on how much their younger children were learning, and Miss Hartley confided that hiring Catherine was the best decision she had made in years. Winter came early to the San Luis Valley that year, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping well below freezing. Catherine learned to navigate the harsh weather, to dress in layers, and manage the cattle in blizzard conditions. She discovered reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, and Thomas watched her with growing admiration. "You are tougher than you look," he teased one evening after she had helped him break ice on the watering troughs. "I am full of surprises," Catherine replied, kissing him on his cold nose. In January, Catherine missed her monthly courses and realized with a mixture of joy and terror that she was likely pregnant. She told Thomas one night as they lay in bed, his arms around her. "I think I am carrying your child," she said softly. Thomas went very still, and then he rolled to face her, his eyes searching hers in the lamplight. "Truly, I believe so. It is early yet, but the signs are there." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming him. "A child, our child." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "When? Late summer, if my calculations are correct. August, perhaps. You will have to stop teaching," Thomas said immediately, "and no more heavy ranch work." "I will teach through April," Catherine countered. "And I will continue to do what I can on the ranch. I am pregnant, Thomas, not an invalid." They compromised as they had learned to do in their months of marriage. Catherine would teach through the end of the school term in May, and then focus on preparing for the baby. She would do lighter ranch tasks, but no heavy lifting or dangerous work. Thomas tried not to hover, but Catherine often caught him watching her with a mixture of pride and worry that made her heart melt. Dr. Morrison confirmed the pregnancy in February and pronounced Catherine healthy and strong. Martha was beside herself with excitement, already knitting tiny booties and blankets. The ranch hands offered shy congratulations, and Ben Tucker whittled a small wooden horse for the baby. Catherine continued teaching through the spring, her energy and enthusiasm never waning even as her body changed. The children were fascinated by her growing belly, and she used it as a teaching opportunity, explaining about how babies grew and developed. Some of the more conservative parents grumbled, but most appreciated her straightforward, honest approach. In May, she said goodbye to her students with genuine sadness and promised Miss Hartley she would return to teaching in a few years when the baby was older. Then she focused all her attention on preparing for motherhood. Martha taught her to make baby clothes, to prepare the small bedroom they had chosen for the nursery. Thomas built a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Summer arrived hot and dry, and Catherine grew large and uncomfortable. She could no longer ride horses or help with much of the ranch work, but she found other ways to be useful. She updated all of the ranch records, organized years of correspondence, and created a filing system that made Thomas's business records easily accessible. She also spent time writing, recording stories of her journey west, her time at the ranch, and her growing love for Thomas. She wanted their child to know their story someday. In mid-August, on a sweltering afternoon, Catherine's labor began. Thomas rode hard to fetch Dr. Morrison while Martha stayed with Catherine, wiping her forehead with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but finally, as the sun rose on a new morning, their son was born. They named him Jonathan, after Thomas's father, and he was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. Thomas held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Catherine watched them with a heart so full she thought it might burst. "He is beautiful," Thomas whispered. "You are amazing." "I cannot believe you did that." "We did it," Catherine corrected. "Together." The next months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, of learning to care for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. Martha was invaluable, stepping in when Catherine was exhausted, teaching them both the skills they needed. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, waking for midnight feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his son and marveling at him. Jonathan grew strong and healthy, hitting every milestone right on schedule. By his first birthday, he was walking and babbling and getting into everything. Catherine found that she loved being a mother, though she also missed teaching. She made arrangements to return to the school part-time in the fall, teaching just 2 days a week, so she could still be home with Jonathan. Life continued its rhythm. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Catherine's teaching position evolved into something even better when the school board asked her to help train new teachers throughout the valley. Jonathan grew from a baby into a toddler, and then a little boy, curious and bright and full of energy just like his father. When Jonathan was 3, Catherine became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter arrived in early spring without the drama of Jonathan's birth. They named her Sarah, and she had Catherine's green eyes and Thomas's dark hair. Jonathan was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to help care for her. The years flowed by, marked by seasons and harvests, by school terms and cattle drives. They added on to the house as their family grew, creating more bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Martha grew older but no less essential to their household. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the largest and most respected operations in the San Luis Valley. Catherine never forgot that day in the desert, when she had been certain she would die alone under the brutal sun. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when she sat on the porch with Thomas, watching their children play in the yard, she would think about how close she had come to missing all of this. How a wagon train's cruel decision and Thomas's fortunate timing had changed the entire course of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas would ask, sensing her mood. "How lucky I am," she would reply. "How grateful." "I am the lucky one," Thomas would argue. "I found a treasure lying in the desert that day." "We found each other," Catherine would say, and that was the truth. As the children grew older, they learned the story of how their parents met. Jonathan and Sarah never tired of hearing about their mother's dramatic rescue, about the wagon train that left her behind and the cowboy who saved her. It became a family legend, a story that was repeated and embellished with each telling. When Jonathan was 12 and Sarah was 9, Catherine made the decision to take on a full-time teaching position again. Miss Hartley had finally retired, and the school board offered Catherine the position of head teacher. It was a significant responsibility, but Catherine felt ready for it. Her children were old enough to not need constant supervision, and she missed the daily interaction with students. Thomas supported her decision completely, never once suggesting that her place was solely at home. He had always seen her as his partner, had always valued her mind and her capabilities as much as her role as wife and mother. It was one of the many reasons she loved him. The years continued their march. Jonathan grew into a strong young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Sarah developed a passion for horses, particularly the breeding program, and proved to have an excellent eye for bloodlines and conformation. Catherine taught generations of Valley children, becoming a beloved and respected figure in Fort Garland. Thomas expanded the ranch, purchasing additional land and increasing their herds. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep when she was 83, and they buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch she had helped build. It was a profound loss, but they took comfort in knowing she had lived a long, full life and had been loved. Catherine was 45 when the letter arrived from St. Louis. It was from a lawyer, informing her that a distant cousin had passed away and left her a small inheritance. The amount was modest, but attached to the letter was something far more valuable to Catherine: her old trunk from the wagon train. Somehow, the trunk had survived, passed through various hands, and eventually made its way back to St. Louis, where the lawyer had tracked it down. When it arrived at the ranch months later, Catherine opened it with shaking hands. Inside were her books, her mother's jewelry, photographs of her family, and the guidebook she had studied so carefully all those years ago. She sat on the floor of the bedroom, surrounded by these ghosts of her past life, and wept, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of her life coming full circle. She had been so young when she left St. Louis, so determined to make her own way, and she had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But she had done it in a way she never could have imagined, not through solitary independence but through partnership and love. Thomas found her there and sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Catherine said, wiping her eyes. "I am home." They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a large party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from all over the valley, and even some of Catherine's former students, now adults with families of their own, made the journey. Jonathan brought his new wife, a lovely young woman named Emma who fit into the family as though she had always been there. Sarah, at 21, was being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher, and Catherine suspected there would be another wedding soon. As Catherine stood on the porch, looking out at the gathering of people who had become their community, their family, she felt Thomas slip his arm around her waist. 25 years, he said softly, and I love you more now than I did the day I found you in the desert. I love you more too, Catherine replied, though I was fairly certain I was going to love you even then, once I stopped being delirious with fever. Thomas laughed, the sound rich and warm. I took one look at you, all fierce and determined even though you were half dead, and I thought, this is a woman worth knowing. I am glad you thought so. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains, just as they had done thousands of times before. The valley spread out before them, golden in the fading light, and Catherine thought about the wagon train that had left her behind, the cruel decision that had seemed like a death sentence. If she could go back in time and tell her 22-year-old self what was coming, what would she say? She would say that sometimes the worst moments of your life are actually the beginning of the best ones. She would say that love comes when you least expect it, in the form of a cowboy with gentle hands and a kind heart. She would say that home is not a place you arrive at, but something you build day by day with the people you love. Jonathan and Emma announced at the party that they were expecting a baby, the first grandchild, and Catherine felt her heart swell with joy. This was legacy, she realized. Not just the ranch or the land or the material things they had built, but this. The love they had created, the family they had raised, the community they had nurtured. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Catherine helped clean up, her daughter and daughter-in-law working beside her. The men took care of the horses and livestock, and soon the ranch was quiet again, back to its normal rhythm. That night, as Catherine and Thomas prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. There were lines around her eyes now, silver threading through her dark hair, but she liked what she saw. This was a face that had lived, that had loved, that had experienced joy and sorrow and everything in between. You are staring at yourself, Thomas observed from where he was pulling off his boots. I am thinking about how much has changed since you found me. Everything has changed, Thomas agreed, and nothing has. I still wake up every morning grateful that you are beside me. Catherine turned from the mirror and went to him, sitting beside him on the bed. I was so lost when you found me. I thought my life was over, and in a way it was. That life, the one I had planned, died in the desert. But this life, the one we built together, is so much better than anything I could have imagined. I was lost too before you, Thomas admitted. I had the ranch, I had work and purpose, but I was lonely. I did not even realize how lonely until you were here, and suddenly the house felt alive. They lay down together, fitting into the comfortable positions they had found over 25 years of sharing a bed. Catherine rested her head on Thomas's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Do you think about that day? Thomas asked quietly. The day I found you. Sometimes. Do you? All the time. I think about what would have happened if I had ridden a different direction that day, if I had not decided to check that western pasture. You would have died out there, and I never would have known you existed. But you did ride that direction, Catherine said firmly, and you did find me, and we did build this life. That is what matters. That is what matters, Thomas agreed. The years continued to unfold. Jonathan and Emma had 3 children, and Sarah married her rancher and had 2. Catherine became a grandmother 5 times over, and she delighted in her grandchildren the way she had delighted in her own children. She continued teaching until she was 60, finally retiring when the school board insisted she had earned her rest. Thomas handed over more and more of the ranch operations to Jonathan as he got older, though he never stopped working entirely. The land was in his blood, and Catherine knew he would be riding and checking cattle until his last day. She did not mind. She understood that the ranch was as much a part of him as his heart and lungs. They grew old together, their hands growing gnarled but still fitting perfectly together, their hair turning silver but their love remaining strong. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset over the same mountains they had watched for decades. They told stories to their grandchildren about the old days, about how the valley had changed, about the life they had built together. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a grand celebration. It seemed like the entire valley turned out, 3 generations of families that Catherine had taught, ranchers that Thomas had done business with, friends and neighbors who had become family over the decades. There were speeches and toasts, and Catherine cried happy tears as people shared stories about how she and Thomas had impacted their lives. 50 years, Thomas said in his speech, his voice still strong despite his 78 years. 50 years ago, I found a woman dying in the desert, and I thought I was saving her life. But the truth is, she saved mine. Catherine has been my partner, my best friend, my love, and my inspiration. She has made every day of these 50 years an adventure. I am the luckiest man who ever lived. Catherine stood and kissed him, not caring that everyone was watching, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. That night, exhausted but happy, they lay in bed together. Catherine's joints ached and Thomas's back was stiff, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. 50 years, Catherine murmured. Can you believe it? Every day and not at all, Thomas replied. Sometimes I still see you as that fierce young woman I found in the desert. Other times I look at you and see every year we have lived, every moment we have shared. I am glad we have shared them, Catherine said. Every single one, even the hard times, especially the hard times. They made the good times better. They drifted off to sleep, and Catherine dreamed of the desert, of the moment when Thomas had appeared like a vision blocking out the sun. In her dream, she watched herself from a distance, saw how close she had come to death, saw Thomas's face as he found her, and she heard him speak, words he had not actually said that day but that she understood now were true. I have been looking for you, Dream Thomas said. I did not know it, but I have been searching for you all my life. And I have been waiting, Dream Catherine replied, even when I did not know what I was waiting for. Catherine woke to find the sun streaming through the bedroom window and Thomas sleeping peacefully beside her. She studied his face, still handsome to her despite the lines and wrinkles, and felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. They had more years together, good years filled with grandchildren's laughter and quiet evenings, and the satisfaction of a life well lived. Thomas was 82 when he finally slowed down, his body giving out even as his spirit remained strong. He died peacefully one spring morning, Catherine holding his hand, their children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. I love you, Catherine whispered to him. I have loved you every day since you found me. Thomas smiled, his eyes warm even as they clouded with approaching death. Best day of my life, he murmured, finding you, and then he was gone, slipping away as gently as he had lived. Catherine grieved, but not with despair. She missed Thomas with an ache that never fully went away, but she also felt grateful for the 53 years they had shared. She stayed at the ranch, helping Jonathan run the operation, teaching her grandchildren to ride and rope and love the land the way their grandfather had. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch alone, watching the sunset over the mountains, and she would talk to Thomas as though he was still beside her. She would tell him about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about the ranch's successes, about her day. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, She could almost hear his voice answering her. Catherine lived to be 87 years old, remaining sharp and active until her final weeks. She died surrounded by family, in the same bedroom where she had given birth to her children, where she had spent decades sleeping beside the love of her life. Her last words were, "I am coming, Thomas. Wait for me." They buried her beside Thomas on the hill overlooking the ranch, the same hill where Martha rested. The funeral was enormous, attended by over 200 people whose lives she had touched through teaching, through friendship, through simple kindness. Her students, now elderly themselves, spoke about how she had changed their lives. Her children and grandchildren shared stories about her strength, her wisdom, her unwavering love. Jonathan, now in his 60s himself, stood at his mother's grave after everyone else had left. His own children and grandchildren waited respectfully at a distance, giving him this moment. "Thank you, Ma," he said quietly. "Thank you for showing me what love looks like, what partnership means, what it takes to build a life worth living. Thank you for choosing to stay all those years ago, for choosing Dad, for choosing this ranch and this valley. Everything I am, everything we all are, comes from the choice you made to say yes to a cowboy who found you in the desert." He placed wildflowers on her grave, the same kind that had been in her wedding bouquet over 6 decades before, and walked back to his family. Behind him, the ranch stretched out in all its glory, a testament to the love story that had begun with a wagon train's cruelty and a cowboy's compassion. The Twin Pine Ranch continued to thrive under Jonathan's management, and later under his children's care. Sarah's children took over the horse breeding program, expanding it in ways that would have made their grandmother proud. The house remained full of life and laughter, of family gatherings and celebrations, just as Catherine and Thomas had always wanted. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, family members sitting on that old porch would swear they could see 2 figures standing together at the edge of the pasture, a man with his arm around a woman, both of them looking out at the land they had built together. It was probably just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the setting sun, but it comforted those who saw it to think that Catherine and Thomas were still there, still watching over the ranch and the family they had created. The story of how they met became family legend, passed down through generations. Great-grandchildren who never knew them personally grew up hearing about the wagon train that abandoned Catherine, the cowboy who rescued her, and the love story that had unfolded in the aftermath. It became a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of life lead to the best ones, that love can be found in unexpected places, and that home is not where you come from but where you choose to be. In Fort Garland, a plaque was placed at the school honoring Thomas Addison, who had taught 3 generations of Valley children and had touched countless lives with her dedication and kindness. The elementary school was eventually renamed the Thomas Addison School, ensuring that her legacy would endure long after anyone who knew her personally had passed. The ranch itself became a historical landmark, recognized by the state of Colorado for its significance to the valley's development, and for being one of the longest continuously operating family ranches in the region. Tours were offered occasionally, with family members sharing stories about Thomas and Catherine, about how the ranch had grown from a single man's dream into a multi-generational success. But more than plaques or landmarks or historical recognition, the real legacy of Catherine and Thomas Addison was found in the love they had shared and the family they had built. It was found in the way their descendants treated each other with respect and kindness, the way they valued partnership and equality in their own marriages, the way they faced hardships with determination and celebrated victories with grace. It was found in the sunset over the mountains, in the grass growing green each spring, in the cattle grazing in the pastures, in the horses running free in the corrals. It was found in every child who learned to read in the school that bore Catherine's name, in every rancher who benefited from the breeding program she and Thomas had started, in every person who heard their story and felt inspired to believe in second chances and unexpected love. The wagon train that had left Catherine behind in 1872 was long forgotten. The people involved turned to dust, their cruelty lost to time. But the love story that began because of that abandonment lived on, a testament to the fact that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the door opening to something better than we ever imagined. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Catherine and Thomas were together still, their hands intertwined, their love eternal, watching over the legacy they had created and smiling at the knowledge that they had done it right. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built something beautiful from nothing, had loved completely and lived fully. That wagon train had left Catherine behind in the dust, discarded and forgotten. But a cowboy had found her and taken her home. Not to a place, but to a life, to a love, to a future that exceeded every dream she had ever dared to dream. And in the end, that made all the difference.